Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I have nice warm weather. I left a meter of snow in my hometown, and the weather was very cold. So it is delightful. Even if it is raining, it's still delightful to feel the warm weather. So I'm excited to be here. And after the long trip, I slept most of the way and then was 12 hours late, so I didn't get in till last night and had all night to sleep. So I'm feeling pretty good. I want to talk about my research on what works in corrections. And I've really worked with a lot of colleagues on different parts of this project. Most recently, Gary Zajac and I completed a report for the Academy of Sciences, the Academies of Science in the US, where they were actually working on the incarceration problem of incarceration in the US. And several of the members were upset because their conclusions were that nothing works to change offenders. And so they asked us to complete a report on kind of updating the what works research. I've also worked with many other people who have helped in this project. So what I want to, let's make sure I get this working. Am I holding it? Ah. Okay, I was holding it the wrong way. All right, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the changes in the U.S. in philosophy of corrections, the impact of those changes, then the move towards evidence-based corrections, talking about the quality of work, with what works, and finally, fidelity and implementation, which has been not discussed as much in the what works focus. Right? I start by going back to Martinson's report so many years ago, where he concluded from, they were asked to, actually Lipton, Wilkes, and Martinson were asked to evaluate correctional programs for the state of New York. The state had just had a big riot in Attica where both the staff and inmates were killed. Public was very upset about this, and so they asked this group of researchers to please tell us what works so we can implement those programs. And they looked at the work that had been done up to that point, up to 1973, I think they stopped. And Martinson wrote an article saying, with few and isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have had no appreciable effect on recidivism. Well, most people at the time interpreted that as nothing works. So there was a frustration that nothing works. If nothing works, why should we go ahead with our rehabilitation programs? Now, there were lots of voices that argued against this, but it seemed to be accepted for quite a few years that nothing works. And then I think important for us to realize is that really what they were saying is that the designs and methods were so inadequate and the programs were implemented so poorly that it was impossible really to tell whether anything could work. So it wasn't that nothing could work. It was just that to that point in time, they didn't see evidence that programs were working. Others argued and said, look, there are programs that worked, but it really had a major impact on what happened in corrections in the US. Frank Cullen and some of his colleagues, though, argued that really there were greater things that influenced this change to nothing works and the change in our correctional philosophy. Part of that was a social upheaval at the time in the US, and I believe you went through some of this in your country, With civil rights, we had a movement with civil rights, which was a real problem with race issues in our country. And I guess if you've followed the news, you know we still have those issues with police force and treatment of minority groups. We had women's rights were coming in. There was demand for sexual freedom, protests against the war in Vietnam. And in corrections, they had particular problems because research and evidence was coming out that it was really unfair to many minorities and others in the system. And also there were riots where people were being killed. So this social chaos and the problems with corrections led to a major and dramatic change in U.S. corrections, where we moved away from rehabilitation. Even though those programs hadn't been implemented well, the philosophy was still strongly in favor of rehabilitation. Now we saw this punitive law and order mentality come in, a focus on deterrence, make the punishments onerous, incarceration, incapacitation. If they're locked up, they can't commit crimes. So essentially, we saw a change in corrections, and what I'm arguing here is that we also saw a change in what was studied. So some of the reason that we see the programs that have been studied and some of the better research was done on these punitive programs. But just a moment to show you that, I don't know how I get that point. Anyway, you can see move away from rehabilitation. This is from 1930 until 2010, that we see a relatively straight incarceration rate, the rate per 100,000. Who are incarcerated. And then in 75, about the time of the social chaos, we see this enormous growth in our incarceration rate. And it leveled off a bit recently, but at a higher level. So there's some debate about whether we're going to be able to bring it back down. There's a group of people, of course, who are interested in trying to bring that incarceration rate down, saying we haven't been successful in our policies in reducing crime, that any crime drop has not been directly related to what we've been doing with offenders. We've been damaging communities and individuals, and they want to bring it down. Others, like Al Blumstein, have argued that, no, once we're up there, we're going to stay up there, and it's not going to come down. It's just going to level off at a higher level. So there's some debate about what we can do. But I digress. Changes, so some of the changes then that I wanted to talk about since the Martinson report is the correctional philosophy, big difference. And then a more recent movement towards evidence-based corrections, an improvement in the quality of the research. Remember, he argued, the argument was that the research was so poorly done that you couldn't tell what worked. And then an emphasis on rehabilitation, which is relatively recent. The second argument against Martinson's work was that the programs were implemented so poorly you couldn't tell what worked. So I want to talk a little bit about these. The changes in philosophy were towards more punitive, law and order, incapacitation, and deterrence. The kinds of programs or interventions under these models are correctional boot camps, longer prison sentences, more prison sentences, urine testing that wasn't combined with drug treatment, just using urine testing as a way to discourage people from using drugs. And then intensive supervision. Again, this is intensive supervision that was focused on control, supervision, and requirements, not on providing services. So prior to the 80s focus on intensive supervision, there had been some intensive supervision programs that were really focusing on trying to provide services and treatment. later that changed to more of a focus on controlling offenders, with the idea if you watch them, then you can keep them from committing crimes. So we move into what I want to talk about is evidence-based corrections, which is the idea that we can use science in decision-making. A lot of people talk about evidence-based corrections, and they mean a lot of different things, and their arguments for why something is evidence-based is vary greatly. It's kind of a buzzword. I don't know if it's a buzzword here, but yes, okay, it is definitely a buzzword in the US, and the way it's used is often varies greatly. So essentially the focus is to identify effective correctional programs, and I think most of us agree that evidence-based corrections, that is the focus. But it's also using science to make decisions about what works. And I think the way we interpret that is probably varies greatly. But what I'd like to talk about is the work that I started with previously, then completed this book on what works in corrections. What have we learned from the research? I focus on reducing recidivism. And sometimes I get arguments from people about why are you focusing on recidivism? And because one of the things I found as you talk to policymakers is that they often are, they're assuming it's going to reduce recidivism when you talk about having an impact on increasing education or some kind of other program that's provided to inmates, that the assumption is it's going to reduce their criminal activities. And so my argument was, let's start with that, have that as a focus. I'm not saying that other things, educating, giving prison inmates education programs, trying to change their thinking, I'm not saying those aren't important, and they are important to measure and understand. But that when we're talking with policymakers, we're really focusing frequently on let's reduce their criminal activities when they're released or when they're not under supervision or after we've caught them. I talk about it as management strategies, programs, interventions, and treatment, because if you come from a psychological background, as I do, treatment means something very different than just the way it's used. If you talk about experiments, the group that gets the treatment is something very different. It's the person that gets the new intervention. Or people sometimes think of treatment as anything that we do. And I think we really need to think about these as separate. Treatment as more a rehabilitation focus as opposed to providing services or providing some kind of management strategy like drug courts, which is more than just providing treatment. It's also a management strategy. All right, so when I then talking about science, evidence-based corrections, what we decided to do, my colleagues and I, we used two things to make decisions about what works. One is an assessment that we used in a report to Congress that I'll call the Maryland Research Assessment, that actually examines the quality of the research as well as the significance and direction of the effects. Because frequently we saw people reporting on very poorly designed research, and they would report significance, and everybody would say, oh, it's significant. But it was very poorly designed research. So our idea was that you really need to look at the quality of the research. Was the quality strong enough to really allow you to make an assumption about differences between groups and the impact of the intervention? And the other way I use to make decisions is meta-analysis, a new statistical technique that and I'm going to describe both of these in more detail. I'm not going to put formulas up, though, just in case you were worried. Okay, the Maryland report to Congress, the Congress wanted a report that said, we're spending a great deal of money on and trying to make decisions. We want to know if these prevention programs work. So we had 6 months in order to look at corrections, policing, prevention, all types of programs in the criminal justice system and answer the question of, do they work? And we came up with this assessment and a way of making decisions about what works, what doesn't, and what's promising. So the way we made the decision, as I said before, is we were looking at both the quality of the research and the significance. So our first goal was a two-stage assessment where we said we looked for all studies of a certain intervention, like in corrections, drug courts, all studies we could find of drug courts. And then we assessed each study for the quality of the research and the significance and direction of the outcome. So we had a group of studies, each one of the studies we examined for quality of research, significance, and outcome. And then we made decisions about what works on the basis of all of the studies. And what's important to realize here is this is how we classified the studies. On a score of 1 to 5, with 5 being the gold standard randomized controlled trial. For those of you who don't think we need to do randomized controlled trials in corrections, all I can say is, do you really want a treatment if you find out you have cancer? Do you want a treatment that hasn't been tested in a randomized controlled trial? Would you really pick a poor quality study to help you make decisions about what treatment you want for a medical problem? There is a difference in the quality of research. So 1 to 5, 1 was such poor quality it wasn't worth considering at all. 2, the studies were things like they would be comparing dropouts to completers in a comparison study. Well, the problem with that is the dropouts were probably different, and it didn't have anything to do with the treatment that they received. So it's a really poor way to make decisions. It's not a very good, strong study. And some of the research is amazing, the number of studies that were done, like drug treatment. If you look at the research on drug treatment, a lot of that research really has used comparisons of dropouts to completers, which has real problems because you don't know what the treatment did. Obviously, the people that dropped out were different in some way because they dropped out. So anyway, 3 was a reasonable comparison group was used in the study. So the samples, this is really an internal validity scale. So 3 is they were reasonable comparison groups. 4, they really went above and beyond by matching or propensity scoring methods. And then 5 they randomized the 2 groups. So it's an experimental design. So we use those to try to make decisions about the quality of the research. The second way we made decisions, then we actually, once we made that decision of the quality of the research, we had decision rules about how many studies there had to be to say that something worked or we did not have evidence. The evidence wasn't strong enough to say it worked. The other way that we then, out of this work, we got interested in meta-analysis, which is actually using studies as the unit of analysis. So unlike the way we did the previous studies where we classified them and then had decision rules, meta-analysis actually is a quantitative way using studies as the unit of analysis to look at a group of studies and their effectiveness. One of the benefits of this is that you have larger numbers, so you have more power to detect differences. One of the disadvantages in using meta-analysis is it's very hard to code, and you want to make sure that you have a similarity of the studies that you're including and a reason for including them. So the meta-analysis is a quantitative analysis. Unit of analysis is a group of studies. The outcome are effect sizes. And I know yesterday you had some discussion about economics and how we translate the results of research into what the costs then of these programs are. Well, this is what Washington State has been doing, using the effect sizes from meta-analysis and translating that into costs. So they go one step further, using the research we're doing on determining effect sizes. They then take those and translate it into costs. I'm not an economist, so I won't go into that, but I know you had a discussion yesterday, and that's where they get this data, is from the meta-analyses. So anyway, it's careful coding. Each study is carefully coded so that you can try to look at why it was or was not effective. And I'm going to give an example for those of you who aren't familiar with meta-analysis. Sorry, those of you that aren't. If you look here, this is a meta-analysis that we did. We had to search, and you do intensive searches through any documents that you can find, published, unpublished, writing to people who might have done the research, doing database searches. We found 771 documents. So these are documents that look like they're studies. It says a little bit now about how many are good studies when you look at the large number. Now, some of these are descriptive, and that's important. But there are others that call themselves studies that really aren't. Anyway, we found 152 that were relevant, that looked like they would really be comparison group studies that could be used in a meta-analysis. Then trying to locate those is a real problem. We found 144. Of those, we found, and down on your left-hand side, there were 29 eligible studies, but many of the studies had 2 or 3 comparisons. So altogether, we got 41 independent samples that were then included in the meta-analysis. So the unit of analysis are these 41 independent samples that we could then use in the meta-analysis. Okay. So this is the closest I'll get to an equation, and it's really designed for policymakers. So those of you who are policymakers, I think I can explain it. All right, it's called a forest plot. On the left-hand side are the studies listed. So you can go and find the study, exact study, with the date of the study. So that's the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, well, then in the graph, there is, on the right-hand, your right-hand side, it says favors boot camp. If it's on the left-hand side of the vertical line, it says favors comparison group. So if it's on that side, boot camps don't look very good. If it's on your right-hand side, boot camps look good. The diamonds are the central tendency. The lines are the confidence interval. If the line goes over the center, then there's no significant difference. So the takeaway from this is you can see about the same number on the right as on the left. So about the same number of studies looked like they favored boot camps, about the same number favored the comparison group. The lines, many of them, most of them, cross over the center line, which means there's no difference between groups. On the very bottom is the overall odds ratio, effect size, that's right on the line. So essentially, boot camps, not effective. And I've actually received some phone calls and emails from people in Australia that seem interested in starting a boot camp or were planning to. So I have been studying those many, many years. So if anybody does want to talk more about that, we could. But anyway, what the takeaway here is boot camps are not effective according to the meta-analysis when you look at these groups. Now, what I wanted to show you is a comparison of in-prison drug treatment, where we have different results. If you look at again, the studies on the left-hand side with the N, this time the date and the N, and favors treatment on the right-hand side, favors comparison on the left-hand side of the vertical line. Here you see many more on the right-hand side. The lines, horizontal lines, the confidence intervals many of them do not go over the center line. And if you look at the overall mean odds, it's on the right-hand side, favoring drug treatment in correctional facilities. So this was another meta-analysis my colleagues and I completed, and I show you this just to show you the difference in what the graph will look like when it's actually effective. So using these two techniques, looking at quality, many of the meta-analyses actually use the quality of the research score that we developed in the meta-analysis, or else they'll look for different components that would show that the research had problems with the methods and design. So they can actually then compare, are the stronger designs the same as the weaker designs? And a lot of times they'll find that there's no difference, but as I must remind you, there's a small number of randomized trials in many of these. Some meta-analysis use only randomized trials, but very few could do that in corrections. An interesting place to get data on this is the Campbell Collaboration website, which I have some references at the end of this talk, so that we'll send you there. Anyway, quality of research. Over time, we've seen an improvement in the quality of research. Farrington and Welsh looked at, first of all, Farrington found only 35 randomized trials from 57 to 81. But then in 2002, when he looked at 82 to 2002, he found 83. So we've seen an increase in randomized trials. But when you look at the number of people that we've got in prisons, the amount of money that we spend for programs, or in prison or on probation and parole, and the amount of money that we spend for programs. And if we want to use evidence-based corrections, and we're saying that we really think this is a good idea, there's still a small number of really strong studies. And as I said, most meta-analysis do control for quality of research, but there's a small number, and they'll say, is there a difference between the stronger research designs and the weaker research designs? And they may find no difference, which for those of you researchers here, that's a null hypothesis argument. So although it says there isn't any difference, it's not a strong conclusion. Okay, so have to see how quickly to go through here because I wanted to leave time for questions. I'll just talk faster. All right, so what have we learned? Okay, we really have seen two types of, two types of meta-analysis that we've seen and to talk about what works. One is comprehensive meta-analysis, where they put a large number of studies into one big. The outcome is still offender behavior or recidivism or delinquency, but that they're putting many different programs in and looking for general principles of effective programs. Here, it's more inclusive. You include more studies in the discussion. The other is intervention specific, which is most of the work I've done has been intervention specific, which I'll talk about, so that I'm talking more specifically about programs, which particular drug courts, boot camps, intensive supervision, those kind. But I do think the comprehensive, did I go the wrong? Okay, so the comprehensive, if we look at the comprehensive, they really have a lot of this work is Andrews and Bonta, John Drow, people from Australia. Another group are Lipsy and his group of people that have done a large number of studies on juveniles. And they find that they find support for general principles that are espoused in the Andrews and Bonta books on R&R perspective. And they also find behavioral and skill-oriented programs. So there are particular types of principles that they've found that are effective in these large, when you look overall at a large number of programs. When you look at intervention specific, this is the work that I've been doing. Here on your left are some of the programs that work. On the right are those that have not been found to work according to either are looking at the rating them and classifying on the quality of the research and the significance, or looking at meta-analysis. So, and all of these, this is an overall, and we could discuss in detail some of the issues, but it does, when you want to describe to policymakers where are we finding the research and what is it showing, and you're talking evidence-based, this is what we're finding as evidence or lack thereof. So we're classifying programs. David Farrington and I were doing some work on trying to classify these and use Lipsy's work and looked at them as surveillance and control, deterrence and punitive programs, discipline, services and opportunities, and then rehabilitation and skill building. Of course, the first three then are and I've given some examples of each. The first three then are really the programs that were developed under the philosophy of corrections as we moved away from rehabilitation into a more punitive perspective. And actually, some of the quality of the research in those areas are better than other programs for two reasons, I think. One is that the programs were very popular. They were being developed and implemented, and researchers therefore could study them. So we see more randomized trials in some of those, like particularly intensive supervision. So if we look at those overall, what we see is the programs developed under that philosophy have not been effective in the deterrence, punitive, discipline. But one question that really comes up is why haven't the services, and here I'm separating out the rehabilitation programs that are skill building versus trying to give services and opportunities. So services and opportunities would be work programs, not where you've given them vocational education, but where you give them opportunities to work, or you're providing housing. Many of our new emphasis are focus on reentry. They've started to give them opportunities. And the argument that we have here is that you're really not stopping them from the street life. So you can give them a job, but that doesn't mean they're going to show up, get to that job. You still have the problem of, are they really interested in that job? Do they want that job? So they don't make it to work on time, they're fresh, and don't actually have a demeanor that works well with the other workers or the person that's their supervisor. So it's a problem. So one of the things that I've proposed is that we really need an individual transition. And this is consistent with Giordano and her colleagues, Maruna, Shover, Farrell, some other researchers who have argued that we really need to change the individual differences, attitudes, thoughts, feelings, knowledge. There's a lot of change that we need to bring about within the individual before we can offer them environmental opportunities. And that in the US, many of our programs for reentry have really focused more on just giving them the environmental opportunities, saying, oh, they'll take advantage of it, when actually I believe that we really need to work on addressing those individual differences so they're ready to take care of the environmental opportunities and change their behavior. So I'm trying to keep it so we have about 10 minutes of questions. So we've come a long way from Martinson. Some programs do work. We have new and better research techniques. The good news is that we have programs that work, increased numbers of experiments. There's an emphasis, and even if it is just a kind of parroting the phrase, evidence-based corrections, more and more there's real interest in how we bring that about. And I add here, because I know you had a talk yesterday, translating these results into costs is extremely important to policymakers. But the bad news is that many of the programs that we've implemented under the law and order emphasis have not been shown to be effective. The quality of our research is still wanting. We have come a long way, but we have a long way to go when we look at other fields using strong research designs. And finally, something we haven't discussed as much in the What Works evidence-based is the implementation issue, so that we really need to continue to work. Some people Paul Gendreau, Ed Latessa, have started to develop some quantitative ways for assessing the fidelity and implementation. And by implementation, I mean things like, are the staff well and appropriately trained? Are they following effective principles that the comprehensive meta-analysis show that certain principles are needed? For effective programs? Are they giving them enough dosage? Like many of the studies of educational programs study whether people entered the program or not, but really don't have any idea how many times they attended class, whether they got a degree. So it's surprising, given that so many facilities give educational programs, that we haven't done more strong research examining the impact of education. Although it looks like it's effective, the quality of the research is really not very strong. Another thing that we need with implementation and fidelity, and what Gendreau and Latessa and some of these others have included, is risk level, that really programs given to low-risk people are maybe very costly, and we really don't need them. They'll often change on their own. It's where you're really going to have an impact is when you focus on higher-risk people. And so we really need, when we look at interventions, we need intervention effectiveness. So that's where I've been talking about intervention effectiveness, but we also have to consider how was it implemented? Was there high, strong implementation or low? And so what we really want is good implementation. Back to Martinson, we wanted programs that are well implemented and that have been shown to be effective. So it's kind of moral imperatives that we move towards more adequate research designs, well implemented programs, using evidence of what works. And that, wow, I have 10 minutes left, and I just wanted, I don't know whether you have a website that you want to put these on a website, or I can put them on my website. Oh, good, okay. So my contact information is there. And then I also, for the website, just a few references to things that I talked about. Thank you.
Doris. We've got plenty of time for questions, and we've got 2 microphones roaming around, so who would like to start?
Great presentation, Doris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Boot camps are one thing to one person and something else to somebody else. We've been living with boot camps for 3 years in Queensland, but actually the public servants who were devising this made heroic efforts to introduce as much evidence and rigorous measurement into the program as possible. So that by the time the government lost power a few weeks ago, the program was actually looking like it had a lot of elements against the odds that actually were as much as possible based on things like cognitive behavioural treatment and some of the more sensible community-based options for the lower risk offenders. In other words, my point is we've got to be careful with labels, and my understanding is that with boot camps, the positive effect sizes tend to be associated with those that had embedded in them things that actually we know do work, like CBT. Is that a fair comment, or have I got
Yes, I know I could talk for hours on the boot camps. I've visited more boot camps and looked at more variety of boot camps. And yes, for all of those, but that's why I said we could discuss in depth each one of these programs. And so where we studied them in the meta-analysis is more the overall military focus. So does the military focus itself do anything? I don't think so. I think the research shows that. If you add evidence-based programs into the boot camp, then yes, actually David Farrington in England found that in the boot camp where they had evidence-based programming, it was effective in reducing the recidivism of the youth. We found in a randomized trial in the state of Maryland that the comparison facility was so disorganized and dangerous that we believe the boot camp didn't change offenders, but the comparison facility made them worse. And this is using my model of we have to change their attitudes. So we did actually look at attitudes, and we found that the people in the boot camp stayed the same. They didn't become more socially positive in their attitudes. But the people in the other facility became more antisocial. And so our argument was a well-implemented boot camp that has some components of evidence-based programs may either improve people's thinking, their ability to adjust, or not be destructive like our correctional facilities could be. The danger in the boot camps is that as they spread across the country, they were poorly implemented with poorly trained staff, And the things I saw going on in some of the boot camps were really destructive to the individuals. So that's one of the concerns, I think, with starting the military background if you don't have really well-trained staff to manage the stress, both the emotional and the physical stress that the participants face, then you can do damage. So thanks for the question.
I just want to briefly add to the Queensland story. Before the previous government came in, I actually did a quasi-experimental trial of a program called the Youth Opportunity Program up there, and proved a reduction in recidivism. And that program was cut 1 week after the government came in and replaced by boot camps. So it's a moral for politicians anyway.
Yes, that's one of the things with the boot camps is they're publicly, for the public and for politicians, they look really good. And that, I think, has been really influential in why they spread so rapidly across the U.S.
Oh, hi. You said that education and vocational education and training is something that actually works in a rehabilitative sense for correctional centres and inmates. Can you point to any, I know off the top of your head, but any sort of research, evidence-based research that's going on in that area that I could have a look at?
That's currently going on?
Well, that has been published anyway.
Oh, yes. I don't know if I put that. I finished a review of that literature, and I can send it to be added to these references if it's not here. I don't think it's here, but that summarizes it up to a few years ago, the work that's been done. My problem with the work that's been done in education is it's really not strong because everybody has this feeling that we have to have education. It's so important in its own right. It's not one of those where even politicians don't say, we don't want education. Most people feel like this is just something we need to do in prisons, which is great. Far be it from me to stop any kind of good programming. But the thing is, we could do more research about how to deliver it, who's getting it. The quality of the research is not strong. Given that we could do two different types, one of the questions is it a general education that changes people's attitudes, so a liberal arts education is valuable, or is it a vocational education where they're actually training to get some ability to make money and work? And we could easily do that without really negatively impacting the chance that we would have people in the educational programs.
So how will I get on, how will I get the thing?
Yes,
All right,
yes, I'll
thanks.
send,
Thank
yeah.
you.
I'm interested in the issue of program fidelity. From a New South Wales perspective, we deliver programs all over the state across probably 100 different locations across community and custody. And even with high quality trained staff, there's so much variability in the delivery of those programs. I was just wondering if you could talk to that issue in terms of that area of research.
Yes, you ought to get in contact with the people in London who have been studying the English prison service and prisons who have been trying to work on those issues. So I'll try to get you a contact because they've been trying to do it on looking at their system. The other thing that's been done is Ed Latessa from Cincinnati has developed a scale of a way to actually evaluate the implementation. So he has quantitative measures of this, and so that's Ed Latessa in Cincinnati, University of Cincinnati. His work might be of interest. And also Paul Gendreau has done, from Canada, has done some work on, again, quantitative measures for trying to look at implementation.
Thank you, Doris. I just want to pursue this notion of implementation. And we all know there are no votes in prisons. Obviously, you might have the best program, but with the worst political will in the world, they're not going to get implemented. How do you overcome the resistance of policymakers, or the resistance that policymakers feel from general population in relation to reducing recidivism, increasing desistance, when there's no votes in that?
Well, I think some of the best work is now this work that translates this what works into financial impact. Because if you look at the work done at the Washington Institute, Washington State, they've actually been very influential with their politics, but that is a very liberal state. And so, and correctional system. So that you're starting with a system that is going to lean towards implementing evidence-based programs. But money talks, so I do think the financial, interpreting the work financially and showing the impact financially is worthwhile.
Suzanne, I've got one over here.
Down there and then.
Thanks very much. Doris, thanks very much for your paper today. And also, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed reading your paper on first doing no harm. And I think it's something that people in the correctional world and everywhere overlook, the terrible damage that we can cause. But in your paper and in this discussion today, you spoke about the importance of this cognitive sort of shift and the shifting in attitudes. And we know from all of the evidence that cognitive behavioural therapy, those sorts of programs work. On the other side, there's very little evidence, as you suggest, about things like housing projects and so on. But today you seem to be postulating that a sequencing thing. You need to change the thinking first, and then you need to provide the services after. Is there any work that actually does demonstrate that the sequencing or a combination of those things has an effect? Because as I said, on the one hand, you've got the evidence that the thinking stuff works and the housing and so on doesn't work. Is there any evidence to suggest if you combine the two or do them in that sequence, there is an impact? And that's an important question for policymakers. They've got to decide, if you've got $100, would you spend it on the in-jail or inside the order cognitive behavioural therapy approach, or would you invest money in the services, which, as you suggest, are becoming increasingly popular?
To answer your last question first, the problem is many people there's another fad, another interest of people is we have to do something about reentry. And so they're starting these programs, giving them services, and then they're going to research it and find that they're not effective. So it's really asking to be studied. I know that Pam Lattimore from RTI has done some work on reentry and looking at people that actually had some cognitive change. And she's promised to publish that, so I can't give you a reference for it yet. But she did this over I think it was 8 years, looking at differences and found some support for that, not a randomized trial, but some support that those people that actually changed during the program in their attitudes did better, reduced recidivism. I just this is another one of those issues where why wouldn't we, if we're talking about evidence-based corrections, this would be such an easy study to do, to actually have some participate in a cognitive program and then get linked to aftercare and services, and others not. I mean, it would be a study that's asking to be done, and I really haven't found anybody. Again, it's that people are, we have to have the aftercare and services, and they come from that philosophy. And I don't know why we haven't seen a good study on that.
I think we've got one more.
Doris, I should say I'm a big fan of randomised controlled trials, but one cautionary note about them and about the Maryland Scientific Methods score is this, that sometimes in the correctional domain, the allocation process itself can influence the quality of the outcome measurement. Let me make that concrete for you. So, for example, if you were comparing sending a juvenile to a court compared with sending them to a restorative justice conference, If they go to a court, they can get a bond. Now, it's possible to commit an offence called breach of bond. If you go to a youth justice conference, no such offence exists yet. So if you're counting offences that have occurred since allocation, you're going to have more things to count for the group that went to the court than you are for the group. And this really came out to me in the Campbell Review of Youth Justice Conferencing or Restorative Justice Conferencing by Larry Sherman and his colleagues. So I guess my main point here is that having a great comparison group or counterfactual is one thing, having high quality measurement of the outcome is equally important.
Yes, I agree on whether, and you're always getting some kind of problem that comes up in the course of the study. I'm trying to think of another example, but I'll use jet lag as an excuse. But I think your point is well taken, that yes, you really do have things happen to your two groups that are not part of the study. And just the fact that one is put into the justice system and all the impacts that that brings with it makes the group's experience very different.
I think we might leave it there. Just could you all join me in thanking Doris again for a wonderful presentation?